couple places I'm going to be pointing to products by Google, and I'm going to put my Google hat on and say this is a Google product, but to a large degree it's going to be open source, if I don't get killed. So first of all, just context. I did a little poll before everybody got in here and asked, how many of you have used serverless before and how many of you are familiar with serverless. There's a lot of information already about it and a lot of different products that are claiming to be serverless. So I'm going to put kind of little of the context from my perspective, what I believe to be serverless, and so you know where I'm coming from. First of all, I strongly believe that serverless is much more than just a function. It's not serverless when you're going just to a web browser and you're pasting some function and then executing. That's great, that's part of that, but it's not the entire picture. The other thing is that for the complete picture of serverless, obviously there's no servers if you're an operator, but if you split it onto those two different models, where we're talking about the operator, the person who is managing the infrastructure, they clearly see the servers, but they have to be able to manage this in a certain way. And the developer who probably should not be able to see the servers, and they should not be charged for the instances when their code is not being run. They should not be locked to a specific infrastructure. So the serverless kind of splits in those two different models. The other thing is that I see a lot of articles talking about the choice that you as a developer have to make, whether you're going to use containers or serverless. And I believe that this is not an or proposition, this is actually an and, that you can have serverless and a container at the same time. Containers are really kind of playing two roles. One of them is the Dockerfile that you use. It is kind of a description of what your software is going to need, what your software is going to require. And the container image that subsequently is built from that Dockerfile is kind of a unit of delivery. That's how you ship your code from point A to point B and run it. And hopefully has a certain aspect of portability. So talking about portability, because serverless gives a lot to the developer, the assumption is that you kind of are taking in a lot of belief and a lot of trust on the party that provides you that service, which means that you're assuming that the security is running there, the updates are applied and all that, which comes with a certain aspect of locking. And we hopefully don't have to make the choice where we either choose a serverless or a locking, but either have a portable infrastructure. So this is kind of the end of my entire context, but really what I'm going to be talking about is Kubernetes as the kind of underlining, I like to call it like a peanut butter that makes all the infrastructures out there the same. And you can now kind of start building certain level of assumptions, how your infrastructure is going to be, how your software is going to be executed on each one of those. Currently, it's really hard to find a cloud service provider that would not be offering Kubernetes as a service. Amazon, Azure, Google, IBM, Red Hat. I mean, you go one by one, and every one of them is offering this. I'm also going to be talking about Knative a little more in a minute here, as well as a project that spun out of Knative called Tecton. So now that we came to a session about Knative, let's talk about Knative. First of all, it's pronounced Knative, not Knative. We've launched Knative about September 2018, so not too long. At that time, there was about 13 different open source projects that were wildly possible, kind of building the same kind of serverless offering on top of Kubernetes. And when we looked at that, I still remember those meetings, when we looked at those different projects, we saw a lot of commonality in each one of them. They were all dealing with building images. They were all building with autoscalers. So we at Google, what we decided to do is kind of step back and say, we don't want to build the 14th one of those frameworks out there and be yet another one. Let's figure out how we can build lower level components that each one of those can use to build their products. And that's kind of what drove Knative to be developed. You can see the address there. You can learn more about the history and different ways you can pronounce it, actually, over there. That's weird. So at the time when we launched it in San Francisco's September 2018, the assumption was that Kubernetes is kind of lingua franca, is already everywhere, so why not use that as a building block? Then we've created these 3 separate areas where we've seen a lot of people building the different capabilities in there. So serving, build, and eventing. There's no specific order to it, so it doesn't matter. But those kind of were the core building blocks that would allow us to codify what building serverless and Kubernetes would look like. At Google, we have created App Engine something to the tune of 12 years ago. And even though it wasn't called serverless at the time, because nobody came up with a fancy word like that, had a lot of the characteristics already 12 years ago. You were sending your code to the server, you never worried about infrastructure, it was auto-scaling for you, give you a certificates back, it was able to do a lot of things for the developer that the developer didn't have to worry about. So we took all those learnings, those 13 years of learning, and applied it into the serving area. We've done a lot of work with building images on Kubernetes, and that's where we put a build. And it's kind of hard to talk about serverless if you don't talk about eventing. So that's an area where we actually wanted to make some effort too. So today, I'm proud to announce, not announce, but tell you, that there's about 6 or 7 different products already built on those building blocks. So people took those low-level components and they built their products. We built 2 of those products called Cloud Run. One of them is running on Kubernetes. The other one is running on Google's infrastructure, exact same API. In fact, each one of those has exact same API. So if you take a container that was built for Knative, you can go and apply and run this container. Run that container on any one of those products. We also have kind of recognized that the area around build is slightly different than the runtime concerns. It has to do with CI/CD and kind of modernization of the application, build pipelines, and so forth. And there was a couple of companies out there like, actually I won't mention it. There was a couple of other companies that wanted to really kind of focus specifically on this area instead of the entire Knative. So we spun up a foundation for build and the project, open source project called Tecton, but it's kind of originated from Knative build. So what does serving can do for you? And I will go from serving and eventing. First of all, if you're building applications, any kind of modern applications today, you probably are not dealing with manual scaling. Like you don't go in and go to the store, buy a new server, bring it in, wire it up, and hopefully you're fast enough so that there is a response. Right? You're looking for something that will give you auto-scaling capability. And if you're running more modern applications, that auto-scaling capability is not based on CPU or RAM utilization. It's most of the time based on request. If you're building an application in modern frameworks, it might not even use any significant amount of I/O. It's going to be a lot of requests, and you have to be able to scale this based on those requests. So Knative out of the box does this for you automatically. It scales on the number of requests. It provides different abilities to introduce additional auto-scaling strategies, so you can build your own, but by default based on requests. The other thing that we've noticed that comes with a lot of the years of dealing with App Engine and others is that if you're thinking about versioning just the code, you're often going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. You have to think about the code and the configuration as a unit. So when you deploy something at a point in time, that it will be kind of immutable. It's never going to be changed. Therefore, you can always go back to the known state. Knative kind of includes the capability to give you that. So when you bring your code and configure that code to run a certain way, it's locked at that point. And you can keep adding new ones, but each one of them is immutable, which means you can come back to it and reinstantiate the same version. The other thing that we've noticed is that if you're building modern applications, it's probably a lot of microservices. And microservices, just purely from a standpoint of, it's super easy to manage 3-5 of them. You know exactly which IPs they have and what they look, what the URLs are. Suddenly you have 20, 40, 100 of them. It's not so easy anymore. Like things are going sideways, you don't know where they're going. So Knative is actually is building the networking and path access capability on top of Istio Mesh, and is allowing you to kind of very quickly and easily identify certain services as internal, so they can be invoked by other services, but they cannot be invoked from outside. They actually don't have a routable path even. It's not like authentication. It's literally there is no path to it. And some of them can be externally accessible. You can do a lot of telemetry around it and a lot of good capabilities. And it can also granular logging, TLS certificates, all of the things that you've kind of recognized to be there from App Engines and other platform as a service are still there. There's a lot of kind of extension capabilities that you can connect to other services. I've named a few in here for different gateways. So there's a lot of pluggability that's built into Knative that if you were to, for example, bring in and you say, I like it, but you know what, I want my Jenkins to be still there. and I don't want to use an external build system. I want to use that. And so you don't have to apply this entire thing, because at the end of the day, Knative are just low-level components. The other one is eventing. So the other thing that we've seen at that time when we were still building Knative is that people were using webhooks like there was no tomorrow, like webhook here, webhook there, and they usually are configured at the point of origination of the webhook, which means you as a receiver literally have no control of these. Because once you configure them, they kind of are inbound to you. You don't have a control point on your side. Sorry, I'm walking in front of this. So what we wanted to do is create a very declarative way of dealing with events so that you can create them at the point of consumption, but still have control points at those webhooks out there. And you can also create other event sources. So you can start consuming the ones that have been already provided by the platform, and there's many of those I'll talk about in a minute. But you can also start creating your own, and there's a number of different ways to do it, but we've provided 2 very easy ways of extending that. And it's declarative. Because it's Kubernetes, so it's declarative API, which means, how many of you are familiar with the kind of the difference between declarative and other means of defining? So if you say, I wish this, I want this, even if you go after the fact and start deleting the resources underneath, Kubernetes will recreate those resources for you. The very same thing applies to eventing. You deal with the desired state and the infrastructure underneath and the services that are used for Knative will reconcile everything to the point that will be looking like that or fail. But if it fails is very visible, so you know what's going on. The other thing that we've decided to use is that you need some kind of envelope. How many of you used to work with like WSDL or something like that for web services? Very common technology, right? In modern days, you probably don't use XML to define your endpoints, although, you know, good days. There is CNCF is kind of the foundation for modern cloud native applications. Define a cloud events, which is kind of like an envelope for all you eventing. So Knative uses those to provide like a wrapper around a lot of those events. So as you're writing your individual event sources, you can wire them up and start routing them without actually intercepting their content, which gives you a lot of flexibility around targeting and consuming resources and routing them in the right way. Similarly to serving a lot of extension capabilities, I'm going to go a little later through like 15 different sources that we already have developed, so you can just consume them, you don't have to write your own. But there's some additional ones. And because of this kind of open source nature of what Knative is, we also wanted to make sure that you can kind of plug in your message brokers underneath the way you want it. So by default, Knative works on the assumption of batteries included, which means if you download that software and install it, or you follow any one of the easy way of provisioning this on top of in a specific cluster, you get one that already works. There's not like 20 different things to configure. So by default, Knative ships with in-memory message broker. So obviously there's no durability in there, so don't use that in production. But you can use Kafka, NATS, PubSub. You can use a number of different ones that are durable and actually will persist over time. All right, as far as community, so again, we launched it in September. It's been phenomenal growth since then. We've released 9 releases, heading strongly towards one very soon. I don't have specific dates yet. There's over 60 different companies that are contributing to it. So this is a project that was originally started by Google, and our launch partners were VMware, Pivotal, and IBM, and SAP. If you're thinking about these kind of companies collaborating with you on a project, you don't see often those type of companies working together. So something must have been special in here. 7,000 pull requests, a lot of good hero numbers. The one that I'm excited about is there's actually 9 different work groups. So if you're coming from Kubernetes land, that's like SIG. We don't call them SIGs, they're just called work groups. But special interest groups, by the way, SIGs, that's what it means. So if you're looking to learn more about Autoscaling and actually contribute there, there's a work group for Autoscaling. If you're looking for operational concerns, how do I scale and deploy this on my cluster? There's a work group for that. And knative.dev is your point where you can go in and learn a lot about it. Does it make sense so far? I'm talking fast? Good. All right, so how do I get Knative? This is an open source software, so if you're coming from a Kubernetes, kubectl is where you live. You might be pronouncing it differently in Europe here, but you know, canonical, cube, whatever you want to call it. But kubectl, the command line, you apply not a bunch of manifests. It's a very common pattern. This is not a brand new thing. If you've done anything with Kubernetes, this is how you install capabilities. So if you go to knative.dev docs install, they will walk you through the entire process. On the end of the day, this is really the extent of installing the entire stack on top of your Knative cluster. Sorry, on top of Kubernetes cluster. Now, if you're not fancy kubectl, you can go to a cloud service provider of your choice. I'm familiar with Google, so I'm going to use that as an example, but there are some other ones that also have similar capabilities. They might not have a UI always, but it will have a CLI way of doing this. But at Google, we have gcloud. If you're doing anything with Google Cloud, you're using gcloud. You're literally, when you're provisioning a brand new cluster, you're just adding one more line. You're saying add on Cloud Run. That's it. The entire stack is provisioned and it's validated too. So we make sure that it's not like, this latest version, but it's actually capabilities that can merge together. If you follow the UI, one box. Just check that, and suddenly the cluster that you're provisioning is provisioned with the entire Knative stack on it. This was my Google hat on for a second here. When you configure the cluster, again, this is plain Kubernetes. We're not hiding any of the capability. We're not changing Kubernetes. In fact, you continue to using Kubernetes the way you were using, but now you have the additional capabilities. So I'm not going to go through each one of those, but there's a lot of configuration options you can do. So for each one of those, you can go and change how long does it take before my instance of my service scales to 0, or custom domain, or where should I send my logs? Again, if you run something on GKE, it will automatically go to something like Stackdriver because it's sensing this. But maybe on your on-premise or on premises when you deploy, you want the entire Elk stack, which by the way, Knative comes with. So when you install Knative, you get the entire the open source version. You get the entire Elk stack configured with Prometheus and Elasticsearch and Kibana and everything else. Sorry, losing my voice. So how to use Knative? Now we go a little deeper. So now you have Kubernetes cluster, you've configured Knative, and if you are an operator, there's a lot of concerns for you, but to a large degree you don't. If you're a developer, you didn't do any of that. This was done for you, right? So now how do I develop applications on top of that? The very simple way you can do is, Knative comes with its own CLI. So if you don't want to deal with kubectl because you never learned Kubernetes and you don't want to, then you can use the Knative CLI. It's not as powerful yet. There's a couple of things you still cannot do in this KN CLI that you can do in kubectl with the YAML file, but it's getting there. So you would go in and you deploy. I'm going to switch and start doing a bunch of demos here. How's that? So I'm going to go from a full screen. Can you see this? All right. It's actually wrapping a little, but hopefully you can see it. So I'll make it a little small. So KN service, name of your service. Let's call this. There we go. This will fit in one line. And then a name of the image or the path to the actual image repository, and I will talk about how do you get to the image later. But assuming you now have the image, how do you deploy? Well, you deploy into namespace. Knative goes through its process. Hopefully I'm still connected to the internet. I think I just lost my connection. Bear with me for a second. For some reason they kicked me out. Maybe my John Smith at AOL is not. Sorry? Oh, really? All right. So let's. There it is. Automatically restarted. So what actually happened now is that Knative took this image. Sorry. Knative took this image. Come on, don't embarrass me. And deploy. I'm using for purposes of the demo. I used to have a fancy application for each one of them, and people were distracted by the application. So I'm using a basic prime calculator. It doesn't get any more basic than that. You can download this application, but all it does, it just calculates prime numbers. So if you changes to here, we just go and calculate. It has a REST interface, so we can use it throughout. So I will do all my demos against this one image, but obviously you have probably more complex application than calculating prime numbers. So that's the extent to which you go. If you deploy, hold on a second. You know, if I just keep like this, so we don't have to switch from full screen. So if you deploy a service, what Knative will automatically do is, because it's multi-tenant service by default, it will use your custom domain, whatever you configured when you created a Knative cluster, will append the project name or namespace, and then the name of the service. So then there is no collision if two projects sharing the same applications. That's configurable actually. You can remove this from a URL and have Knative generate URLs that assume everything in a single namespace. Remember the configuration values that I showed you before? That's how you would do that. All right, so that's one. If you're coming from Kubernetes land, kubectl and YAML is what you live and breathe and eat every day. So you literally, we've defined a type. There's a CRD that Knative installs. You would just use that. You define your name of the service just like in a kubectl command, and then the name of the image. There's a bunch of other options, but that's the extent of this. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep going. Now, I'm going to put my Google hat on. Great, but how about if I don't want to use CLI? How about if I want to put just a UI? Again, you can use gcloud, which is still there, which is kind of the same thing that KN gave you. But let's see if we can deploy an image. So I'm going to log into the Google Cloud command. Oh, great. There we go. I'm going to go. Interesting. Give me a second. I think I know what it is. My logging was terminated. There we go. So if I were in the same process, I already have ready image. I can come in here. I can was Max Prime, I think it was called. Alphabet is hard. And then say I want to deploy it. Remember I showed you there's two different products that Google has. The one with cluster, one without cluster. I'm going to use the one with cluster. Demo, Max Prime. And once it's configured, there is URL. The same application. So it doesn't matter if you use CLI, if you have that image, it doesn't matter where. There's 5 different CLIs from different cloud service providers. There's open source, there's UIs, but bottom line, the experience is one the same. And you know what? Once you configure it here, the YAML file, you can actually copy that entire YAML from here and go to any other cloud service provider and deploy it over there, because the API is what they all adhere to. So it gives you a lot of portability story. All right, that was exciting. Doesn't matter which way you deploy that image. CLI from any one of the ones I showed you, or UI, you're getting the auto-scaling capability out of the box, which means that if you deploy an image, it will register and you can go to it. But if, let's say you're deploying an application that's only used Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, because it's like a business application and it's never used after hours. First of all, what's going to happen is the Cloud Run automatically senses that there is no request coming to it, and it will start terminating those pods that were created as a result of that. Which means that as the request comes in, it will recognize it, will hold the request and start. There's low cold start right now. We're still dealing with maybe 30, 40 milliseconds, but it's barely noticeable for most of the use cases. Now, the 0 to 1, it's interesting, but 1 to N is when it's really interesting. So now let's say you build a marketing campaign for your company. Nobody had an idea how successful it's going to be, right? And some major star, I don't know who's the major star over here in UK, forget about it. Let's not do it. Somebody famous went on Twitter and said, "This is the great campaign," and suddenly, half of the world is going out, right? What Knative will do automatically will start scaling those resources on demand. It will actually start seeing a pattern that, oh, it's growing exponentially. So I need to start warming up things on the back end. It will start kind of do a little clever autoscaling capability for you. Yeah. There's a good demo here, but we're running a little late. I'm going to skip it. By the way, every single one of the demos I showed you and every single thing you see in a slide here is accessible in this repo. Very end in a slide, but you can go and reproduce each one of those demos yourself. So literally from scratch. I'll come back to this. I know you're taking pictures, but sorry. All right, so great. You show me now, if I had an image, then my life is easy. But how about if I don't have an image? So there's a number of options there. Knative defines a serverless container contract, which spells out the expectations that container needs to have. Very minimalistic. To a large degree, any stateless application that listens for environment, that looks for environment variable to start on a specific port. The environment variable is called port. So if you're looking for that environment variable, we will tell you what it is. By default right now is 8080, but it could be something else. You take the environment variable and you start on that application. Again, it has to be stateless. If you're a stateful application, like you're building an actual database, that's probably not the solution for it. But if most of the time the serverless applications right now will be stateless, and probably is to a large degree considered to be a requirement of that. So how do we build images? If you're coming from any kind of image building experience, you're probably coming from Docker. You can continue staying with Docker. Docker build, Docker tag and push, all of that is there. You continue doing exactly the same thing. As long as you end up with a registry, Docker Hub is fine. You can bring it in and use that image. You have also, in many companies, any larger companies actually, most of the time, you have a situation where the developers actually never deploy. There's a CI/CD pipeline or some kind of orchestration that pushes the code, builds the code, tests, validates, lints, whatever else is required. We have a lot of support for that. I put a cloud logo here because I'm kind of have affinity to Google here, but you can use GitHub Actions for that. Works really well. In fact, the demo, one of the demos in the repo that I published there has the instruction how to set that up. You can use GitLab. You can use Jenkins locally on premise. You can use a couple other things there. There's a long list in the repo you can take a look at too. You remember I talked about that Project Tecton? This is slightly different thinking. If you're building images for Kubernetes, maybe you should build them also on Kubernetes because there is some synergy happening there that you can do. It's a first-class building system that's based on top of Kubernetes. It gives you a lot of understanding around the kind of metrics and capabilities that the container needs to have. There's a demo for that too. This is a Java conference, so I thought we were going to do a little Spring Boot application that has APIs and a bunch of other stuff. And it takes about 5 minutes on Jenkins normally to build. I'm going to build it over here. Don't worry, it's not going to take 5 minutes. All right? So, let me show you what I'm going to do here. So first of all, where's my technology? How many of you are familiar with JIB, Java Image Builder? Some clever way of building images where it kind of reorganizes structure of your container so that the dependencies and the layers are minimalized, so that as you make changes, you don't rebuild the entire world, you just make rebuilding the structure. This is a little eyesore for people who have never seen a YAML before, but really what we're doing a couple basic things. First of all, there's some account and information. You can actually, I'm going to be building this image as a specific account, which means I can associate policies to it. You can say, this is a user or a service account that can be used to build images for particular compliance and policy requirements, and therefore has to be built by that person. For another one, you can use another one. So there's a lot of flexibility there. But in this, what we're going to do is I'm going to go and build from a Spring application that I've copied. I didn't write it. I'm going to look for a specific branch in that repo. And I'm going to build that repo has 20 different samples in it. So I'm going to go into a specific directory and build only that one directory. And also because Java and Maven downloads half of the internet when it builds, I'm going to use a cache that allows me to pre-cache it. So the first one is just as long as it was originally, but subsequently JIP will tell me which ones of those need to be refreshed. And when it's all done, I'm going to be building an image and I'm going to push it to a registry. So if you've used Google Cloud before with registry, there's a registry that's available to you in your project automatically. And I'm going to version this one because I like to make sure what I'm deploying. So this is going to get a little loggy, but we'll see. Oh, that was not one. All right. So kubectl apply is the very same thing you've done in Kubernetes. Remember, this is the first-class citizen build system on Kubernetes, so it's exactly the same. I lost my internet actually again, did I? Should I just enter my real name? Make sure I have internet connection. BBC is always a good place to go with that. All right, one more time. Okay, so it's created, and if you go get pause, we can see that the build system started. There's 4 steps that it's going to be using. I can outline this in a second, but it hasn't started any one of them. So what we're going to do now, KL is just a better logging, so we can actually see what's going on in there. I'm going to take a look at it. Now, if I'm slow enough, I might miss the build, because this 3 minutes build, if everything works well, should be about 29, 30 seconds. Again, because of the caching capability that we've added there. You can inject your cache, can be persistent volume, can be remote volume, can be local. The other thing that, as soon as this is finished, I will show you, that there you go, 28, so actually even better. The beauty of this is, here's the trick, that I as a developer never had the entire Java stack. I don't even have Java on my machine. First of all, I didn't have even Docker on my machine. So Docker has implicit requirements around root access and administrative access. If you want your developers to building off of Chromebook or Windows machine, but building for Linux images, unless you're building in Go, that's not that easy, right? Or Java because it's dynamic, but I mean, runtime. But with this, you allow your developers to write the code, they commit, there is a test and everything, and when it is said and done, it can actually build that image for you. The other thing that you get out of the box here, and let me see if I quickly navigate there. Was it Vision? Yeah. This one hasn't been scanned yet. I'm going to use the previous one. The other thing you start seeing here is vulnerabilities. So Java downloaded certain libraries that were not patched yet because the dependencies that we were using. So you get a lot of insight into what's going on in the image. And you can actually start setting, using Tekton, you can start using validated dependencies. So your developers might be using certain version of a library, but if they don't use the one that's being validated and tested, it won't even build. It will just give them an error saying, hey, you reference a invalid version. So a lot of flexibility and capability. Jenkins can do a lot of that too. And Jenkins actually, or CloudBees, the company behind Jenkins, is part of the Tekton project. So if you're using Jenkins X, you're using Tekton, and you're using Knative build already, and you don't even know it. All right. Also, I always mention, because a colleague of mine from a team, if you're looking for very fast reiteration, like build, ship into something, and you're building in a Go, there's a library here that you can do that too. There's a couple other libraries like this for Node.js and others. Now, how many of you have used Cloud Foundry before? If you're coming from Cloud Foundry and you like this Cloud Foundry feel, like CF push and all that, but you want to run on Kubernetes because you have other things there, and you know it's 2019, then we have a project called KF, which is Cloud Foundry-like experience with KF push and service brokers and all those capabilities. In fact, you don't need to make any changes to your application, but instead of CF push, we're using KF push. See it? K for Knative. So it's using the same thing. Remember I talked about Knative being the building blocks, the low-level ones that people can, the Lego pieces that people can use to build different things. This is somebody else building another thing. So we've used Tekton Knative to build a KF. I'm not going to do a demo of that. The beauty of that is that you can actually bring the Java application that you are currently building for Cloud Foundry and continue using the exact same development methodology and everything. This is just build and runtime changes. So as you're deploying with KF instead of Cloud Foundry. All right. So this is all great. Let's talk about a couple of means. I talked a little about this before, but in Knative and any derivative product of that, there's two ways you can build services. You can build public services. They might have authentication, authorization, or something, but they're public. They're accessible. They're routable from outside. Good for website APIs. You know, each one of the APIs might have its own token or something, but it's still public. The other one is, well, if you're building microservices, maybe only one of those applications need to be externally accessible, but 99 other ones that you've built to support that one application don't. So what you can mark them as internal. They're still discoverable by the other applications that are running in the same cluster, but they are not accessible by outside. How are we doing on time? I'm already over time, aren't I? So very quickly, I'm going to demo this. So I have a service in here that, in fact, let's do this. I have a service in here that already published that when given image, oh, we can do better than this. When given an image, it will tell you, use the Vision API, and it will tell you what that image is of. I used to use like McDonald's and others, but the legal department didn't like it. So I'm using Google logo here. I sent a Google logo, and the API said, hey, it's Google. Now that you've seen this, you're probably going in there and invoking my API, right? Because it's public. So to deal with this, I am creating an application that will log you with OAuth and then use the other services behind the scenes. So very quickly go over there. Here's my, why is this so huge? It's got a beautiful OAuth authentication, great. Same logo, and service. Great, right? Except it's not. I can still come in here, I can still call this guy. So how do you deal with this? So let's, with Knative, internal. With Knative, what we can do is there's this notion of cluster local. With one label, with single label, just uncommenting this tag and marking this service as cluster local, I will tell Knative to treat that service as only local. So let's apply this. Where am I? Okay. Somehow my because I can't spell. Sorry. There we go. I renamed the directory a while back. All right, so we've configured the service. So what my application is going to be able to do, I can Did they just kick me out of the internet again? Let's choose the logo here. It still works, the UI still works because it's able to identify and discover the other service. But if I come in here, let's do verbose so we can see the actual error. You see the HTTP 404, the service is not discoverable from outside. I can no longer access this. I'm rushing this because I want to make sure I get to a couple other demos here. You can do this in UI with a single click. You don't have to go labels, but if you kind of prefer that. Because of time, I'm gonna go very quickly through this. Very common thing, you came to a conference, you heard about Knative, you deployed this application, now you have users. And now you found that there is a bug. Well, I would have a bug, you probably don't have bugs, but you deploy a service, and you want to now continue serving the users, but we'll update it to a new version. How many of you are familiar with this whole blue-green notion of deployment? Very familiar. Perfect. So what Knative does is, this is the basic object model. It has the notion of I remember I talked about configuration, which kind of includes both the code and the configuration, and you can have n number of those. So with the route, you can point the route to a specific revision. So if you deploy the first time, there will be revision 1, revision 2, revision 3, just kind of increment it. So you can switch at any given time to any revision, the route. You can do that at any given time simply by editing. But if you're looking for something more exciting, you can do this notion of blue-green. So if you have active users coming to a version, you deploy a new version of that service, but tell it not to take any traffic. So it's kind of like a shadow version. Knative will give you a specific route that you can go and peek at that. You can start looking at it. If you feel good, maybe the metrics tell you that the data is good, logs look good, and everything, you can start shifting traffic. And we at Google never deploy everything globally for everything 100%, so we do like a 2%, 4%. You can do exact same thing like we do at Google. You can do 2%, 3%, 4%. You can do it by hand. You can use it instrumentation. But bottom line is, eventually you get to the point where you say, I'm feeling pretty good. Like this is good. You can shift the entire thing over there. And now these instances, you don't have to do anything because remember, Knative kind of dies as the services don't have any requests, they kind of disappear. So that just happens automatically. Beauty of this is, let's say you deployed globally and now you find something, oh man, that was a problem. You can still come back and put it back to the old version because it's still there. The configuration of how long the version stays around and how long before we start cleaning them, all of that is configurable. So this is how the process works. You go in and you deploy the original service. You update the service, so you tell it to new version, the current version 100%, new version 0%. You then go through this process of little more, check metrics, check stats and everything. And eventually you say 100% over here. And now your new service is over there. The demo for this is actually in the repo, I told you. Again, if you don't fancy command line, you can come in here and you can do all this thing in the UI. Let's talk about Knative eventing for a second. We started late, didn't we? I'm going to go for the extra 10 minutes. I talked about event sources. I selected a few in here that are kind of popular. Obviously, thinking that I'm a Google employee, but I also am Knative fan. So I like to see even services from like somebody like Amazon or Azure, because that's a good kind of validation of our services. There's about 30 of them now that are pre-built, which means you don't have to build them. You're literally with a configuration. You say, I want to attach myself to SQS. And when an event happens on SQS, I want to invoke this service on Knative. The SQS is on AWS, your service is on Knative on your prem, on a Kubernetes cluster on-prem. You can do that. So what Knative does is this notion of naming in software is apparently the most difficult thing. So they used to be called importers. Sorry, they used to be called sources, now they're called importers. And we have a number of different importers you could use. There is this service that kind of translates what that event means outside in the real world and what does it mean inside, and then invokes the actual service through the broker. These cloud events, I remember I talked about cloud events, is a generic way of wrapping those events and telling you what the type of the event is. Type is kind of like a topic in a message broker's methodology, so that you can start filtering and triggering on the topic itself. I mean, on the type. What's getting in here is that these importers will bring the data and put it on a broker with that type. Then you as a developer can start creating different triggers, saying, when I see one of these with this type of specific type, and there could be n number of brokers, by default there's one for a namespace if you label it, you can say on this particular broker, or the default one, if I see an event of this type, I want to execute a service. Now that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, if then this, but you got to start somewhere, right? You can then, I'll come back to the then for a second. So this is definition of the broker. You can see kind of, again, it's YAML, but a lot of that you can kind of abstract through CLI. Broker is discoverable in the entire cluster configuration because it's well-known location. So it's not like your services have to know what they are. They can discover them. And the triggers are super simple. You basically, you name your trigger whatever you want. You give it a filter. You say, this is a demo of when the build finishes, I want to send a message to Slack. So it says, for build statuses from this, I want to invoke a service that will send it to Slack. The service is configured with the API, and whenever it receives one of those events, it just sends it to Slack. So you can build those individual trigger and fire, or you can build crazy over-engineered pipelines, and this is one of them. What we're going to do in here in the last 5 minutes, and hopefully some of you have phones with Twitter on it, get it ready. What we're going to do is we're going to create a pipeline that will have individual services. So in here what we're going to do is we're going to create a source that will capture events with the word Knative in it. Don't tweet yet, because until I start it, it won't matter. What we'll do, it will look for the tweets with the word Knative in it, and we'll put them on a broker. Then we have a trigger that will monitor that broker, and first of all, just capture them. So if I want to replay it over again, it will put them into a document store. Our document store on Google is called Firestore. You can be anything there. Then the other one will say, we'll use the NLP, natural language processing. It will say, is this tweet positive or negative? It's, it's not 100% bulletproof, but it does a pretty good job. This is a public conference and it's recorded, so I'm going to filter the negative ones, and I'm going to put them back on the broker, and I'm going to send them to Slack so our team can see it, but nobody else. The positive ones, I'm going to put back on the broker after the NLP, and I'm going to put them to UI, display it over here. I'm taking a risk, so please don't tweet something that will get me embarrassed or fired. Now, this is Europe, and obviously there's a lot of people from different countries and all that. So you might be tweeting in language that NLP cannot understand. NLP cannot understand. So what's going to happen is going to be error. Knative automatically gives you ability to kind of respond with an error, which allows this to have like a dead letter queue. So in this case, we're going to send everything to a translate API. Translate API will detect what language it is, put it back on a queue, and send it back again. And I'm using the British flag because we speak English, right? All right, so let's see if we can generate this. By the way, all these, just like before, all these files are in here. So I'm going to open one of them just so you can see it. So this is our source. We're looking for the word service. There are some credentials for the API. We're using secrets because you wouldn't want to store the secrets in your YAML file. And then, like in the store case, we have this service that is just like any other of the services before. You deploy it and it has an image and all that. But it's becoming addressable once it's deployed on Knative. And when it's addressable, Knative eventing can target anything addressable. So suddenly you have this capability to set up a trigger that will say, look for the twitter.com, also com.twitter, which is a type that we've created for this. It's an opaque string. It really doesn't mean anything, but allows to filter on. And then send it to a service. I'm not going to run these one by one. I'm just going to fire all of them at once and see what's going to happen. You know what happened, right? This is embarrassing. Asking for a wired internet would have been a good idea. I didn't check the box, though. Back to BBC. All right. That was fast enough so that the retry got me. So it's building all these files. Again, you can do this one by one, and each one of the demos I showed you has an actual like a markdown file with it that walks you through the demo of reproducing. So it will tell you the commands you have to run. You can do it all yourself. So let's go to our tweet viewer first. Make sure that service is up. Let's make it a little slower. All right. Who wants to be helpful here? Anything with any tweet with word Knative. If you don't do it, I'll do it. Please don't get me in trouble. Thank you. Awesome. So the translation happened for NLP purposes. So it still kind of allows us to understand what if it's positive or negative, but the actual language still comes in original. The demo is not perfect. It just puts together kind of something. I'm going to close this in case somebody types something I don't want to see. So hopefully this kind of shows you the capability. In your real world scenario, you might have a number of different cases. You might have like a dead letter queue for errors that a human has to approve. And until human approves, nothing else happens. This supports that. You can have use cases that use remote APIs versus local and combine those. So there's a lot of flexibility in here. We're working in continuing innovating a lot of kind of the developer experience side of story on eventing. Eventing, because of the complexity of this, is not as mature as the what's now V1 API for serving. For eventing, we are nearing beta right now. There's a lot of, if this seems interesting, there's a lot of resources. First of all, let me talk about the use cases, and you can kind of read it yourself. There's a ton of those, of what you can do. There's demos for a lot of them, like the IoT gateway for IoT events, for pre-processing is also one of the demos that I've put together there for you. You can go and take a look at it. So in closing, serverless bigger than function. We talked about this already. Serverless and container. If I see another article out there that talks about the choice you have to make with container or serverless, I'm going to lose it. And serverless with portability, which means that hopefully as you're building this, we think at Google we have a good implementation of Knative that you can come and use. But you know what? If you build on Knative on the product at Google is called Cloud Run. So if you build on Cloud Run today, each one of those applications is portable to any other Knative service offered by IBM, Red Hat, Pivotal, Trigger Mesh, or your own. Don't even wait for any of these companies. Download the open source on your own Kubernetes cluster. If you're using validated Kubernetes distribution, it will be compatible. I think right now we require 1.13 at least, but that's like 1.15 is already out there, so you probably need 2 versions. On the end of the day, Knative doesn't hide any of the underlying layers, which means if you're using like a batch processes, you have some stateful jobs that process I don't know, CSV files from a bucket somewhere, right? You can still use this on the same cluster, and Knative will be a good citizen and it will start kind of using the resources that it can and then letting you use them for something else when it can because of the autoscaling capability. There's a lot of goodness built on here to make the developer lives a lot easier, but you know what? If the product that we built for you or somebody else built using Knative for you is still not meeting your requirements, you can still use the Knative API, even in the fully provisioned service by Google right now, called Cloud Run. You get the nice UI and a G-Cloud and all that. But if you don't find something working for you, you can still use Knative API because it's underneath. So none of this is being hidden. All right, in closing, a ton of documentation out there. This just kind of scratched the surface of what you can do with Knative. There is a Slack channel. There are a set of work groups that you can join and kind of collaborate if you want to. There's a quick start that kind of allows you to kind of skip some of these things together because you can, with a single click, provision a cluster and then suddenly start developing and building on it with custom domain and everything. And anything else that's not covered, just ping me on Twitter. Thank you very much.